everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is an exciting and a very intimidating one. We are going to be annotating War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This book is a brick. The edition that I have is, I could just flip all the way back here. 921 pages is this edition of it, but I think Goodreads typically marks this as longer than that. Yeah, Goodreads has it on there as 1,392 pages, so I think it's partially just that I have it in such a big format that it's less pages, but yeah. So War and Peace, if you don't know, is a classic from Russia. It's really hard to explain what this book is about. You're kind of following a whole cast of characters and just kind of following them through their life. You're mainly following Pierre. Does it? Yeah. So Pierre Bezukov, something like that, is kind of your main character, and then you're following his interactions with all these other people. I first got interested in reading War and Peace because there is a musical based off of it. And the musical is based off of just a teeny tiny part of War and Peace, but it's almost word for word from the book. It's a really fun musical. It's called Natasha, Pierre, and the Great Comet of 1812, I think. So super good music. I really love the musical. Me and Jacob actually recently just went and saw the musical in person, which is crazy because not a lot of people do this one. But it actually had Josh Groban in it on Broadway, and the soundtrack's just really good. So would recommend, even if you're not going to read War and Peace, go listen to the musical. But the musical I liked enough that it got me intrigued into reading War and Peace. So I actually have read this one before. I read it, when would it have been? Maybe 2021, so it might be like 3 years since I last read this book. So this is a reread for me. And in the last few years since I read it, I've kind of been thinking that I'd love to go back and annotate it. I do think there's a lot of really fun descriptions. I do really like Leo Tolstoy's writing. And honestly, annotating it feels like more of a challenge than just reading it to me, because I don't really annotate books often. That's a little scary and intimidating for me, but part of the reason I want to annotate it is because I feel like there are a lot of lines in this book that I've, over the past few years, been like, oh, it's like that one line, but I can't quite think of what it is. But obviously searching for a single line in this brick of a book is super hard. So I'd really like to annotate it. I'd like to code my annotations so that I can find things quicker. I'd also like to mark the part that is the musical, because it's somewhere in there. So I went and got myself some sticky tabs. These are the ones that are like kind of transparent. They're like still colored, but you can see through them. So hopefully that helps. I was gonna get some highlighters, but I was having a really hard time finding highlighters that I actually felt confident wouldn't bleed through my pages, and that's something that drives me crazy. So I think I'm gonna stick with just sticky notes and, wow, sun just went behind the cloud. Sticky notes and a pen, and we'll see how that goes for me for the first little bit. I think that's everything I need to say. Probably just procrastinating at this point, but that's what this video is going to be. As we go through, I will probably read you some of my favorite quotes, tell you my thoughts about it. It's obviously a huge book, so there's a lot going on. This is your heads up that there will probably be spoilers in this video. I don't know that I'm going to be able to really keep it spoiler free, so I'm just gonna go for full spoilers. So if you feel like you don't want War and Peace spoiled for you, maybe don't watch this video. That being said, I'm sure there's lots of people that would rather just have the book spoiled and explained than have to read it. So I'm just gonna go for full spoilers. I will read you all my favorite quotes, and maybe this will convince you to read War and Peace. Maybe at the very least this will convince you to go listen to the musical, because musical is a lot shorter and it's really good. But without further ado, let's get into annotating War and Peace. Hi guys, I am a little over 100 pages. I'm at 116 right now in War and Peace, so I thought I would give you a quick update. I don't know that I'll update super consistently every 100 pages or so, but I thought this would be a good point to pause and give you some of my thoughts so far. I have already gotten some tabs in. The hardcover makes it hard to see. There you go, you can kind of see there. So I have been tapping some stuff. Thoughts so far. Kind of hard to put it all into some cohesive things. First of all, structure of the book. So obviously the title is War and Peace, and that basically is the structure of the book. So you'll have a section of peace times, which obviously the war is still happening, but it's like all the people back at home that aren't involved actively in the war. And then you'll have a section that is the war, where you follow in all the people who are actually out fighting, and then you kind of go back and forth for the first little bit. And at a certain point in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, the war basically gets to the point where it's involving all these people that have been in the peace parts, thinking that they're safe. All of a sudden they're now having to leave their homes. They're kind of involved. So the war catches up to them. And there's probably larger themes about that, about how they're feeling safe from it. And I know there's a lot about Pierre feeling like he wishes he could be at war. And then it finally catches up to him and he gets to be. So I've gotten through one peace section, and I think I'm about halfway through like a war section. If I remember, there's like, it's split up into books, and I think it might kind of switch back and forth when you get to a new book. But let me see. Yeah, so I think each of the books within the book switches back and forth for the first little bit. So I think I'm about halfway through the first war section. One of the things that I think is kind of difficult about this book, overall I think this is a less difficult book than people make it sound, but one thing that is super hard is keeping track of all the names of people. There are so many characters in this book, and every character gets referred to as several different things. You have the name that people call them in society. You have the name that their family and close friends call them. You have their official title, which gets super confusing because you have all of these people that are being referred to as prince or princess or count or countess. You're like, which princess are we talking about right now? It gets a little bit chaotic with that. So that's the one thing that I am struggling with. The names that are of characters in the musical, I have down pretty good. It's the people who aren't in the part that they made the musical off of that I'm having a hard time keeping track of and remembering, which there are quite a few. The musical is specifically about one of the peace sections, and so a lot of the people that are off at war aren't in the musical. One of the things that I love so much about Tolstoy's writing that I'm remembering as I'm going back through this, and this is one of the main things that I'm marking, is Tolstoy has a way of describing just human experiences that are things that everybody knows, but nobody really ever puts into words, if that makes sense. So I've been marking them kind of as like descriptions and funny lines, most of them. But so for example, the latest one that I marked, let me get to it. It's talking about a general, and Kutuzov smiled in a way that seemed to say, "You are quite at liberty not to believe me, and I don't even care whether you do or not, but you have no grounds for telling me so, and that is the whole point." And I feel like there's just a lot of stuff like that where after reading that, you can picture exactly what he's talking about. You know when people make that face, but it's not something that I ever would have thought to like sit down and put into words. And I don't feel like it's something that authors often describe things like that, kind of the, what's the way to put this? The like thoughts that we're having, or like the type of non-verbal communication. I don't feel like that's written in very often, but Tolstoy has a way of writing it almost scathingly, would be how I'd put it. He definitely does not hold his punches back. A lot of them are things that you're like, oh, that's not something that anybody usually describes about characters because it's not very nice. And so some of them are just so funny, like when he's calling, there's a dad that's like calling his kids fools, and there's just like stuff like that that is going on throughout the book. It just adds a lot of personality into the characters. These characters feel super like real people. They don't feel like a fantasy character or like they're in some crazy world. They just feel real because of all the weird little quirks that he gives them, and they just make me laugh. So that's a big part of what I've been marking as I've been going through this, is all of these little lines that are just so funny because they're so relatable. That's how it's going so far. So I'm gonna go read for a bit and see if I can actually make some good progress on this over the next few days. And hopefully I'll have another update for you in not too long. I have reached a little over page 200, so I thought it would be a good time to sit down and kind of walk through what this book is actually about and who some of the main characters are. Just so as I'm going through and explaining my thoughts and quotes and stuff, you know who I'm talking about if you haven't read the book. Again, this is going to be full spoilers, so if for any reason you feel like you're trying to avoid spoilers for War and Peace, you should probably click off the video by now, if you haven't already. The plot of this book is a little hard to explain. It's basically, you're following this whole slew of characters as they go through and experience the Napoleonic Wars, is the brief version of it. As far as characters go, there are a lot of them. I would argue the main character is Pierre. When you start the book, he has just returned. He's in his, like, it sounds like younger 20s-ish. I don't know if it says an exact age, but he's in his younger 20s. He just got back from being educated abroad and is now kind of getting introduced into society. Pretty early on in the book, you find out that he is an illegitimate son of Count Buzikov. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these names wrong, but this is my best go at it. Who is ill and dying. As Count Buzikov is about to die, he basically writes to the emperor and legitimizes Pierre and then leaves his entire fortune to Pierre, which is one of the things that gets so confusing because then Pierre becomes Count Buzikov. The title passes to him, so you kind of have two different people who use that title at some point in the book. So we've got Pierre, he's now super wealthy. In addition to Pierre, you have several other family members that were trying to get the fortune from his dad, one of which is Prince Vasily, who is his, like, uncle? I'm a little unclear on if he's like an uncle or cousin or some relation of some sort. He decides to start basically becoming friends with Pierre in an attempt to get some of the money for himself since he wasn't able to get it in the will. He takes Pierre under his wing. Pierre is super easy to be manipulated, and he basically forces Pierre into a marriage with his daughter Helene. Prince Vasily has 3 kids. There's Hippolyte, Helene, and Anatole. Hippolyte is not super present. He's not a huge character. Helene and Anatole are really big ones. Pierre ends up marrying Helene kind of against his better judgment, and they kind of go from there. Anatole gets sent off to war, and we get back to him eventually. He becomes a big part later. There's 2 other big families, if I remember correctly, one of which is the Rostovas. I think that's correct. Sometimes it says Rostov, and sometimes it says Rostova. I don't know. The mom and the dad are like minor characters. They pop up every once in a while. The 2 main kids that you follow throughout the book are Nicholas and Natasha. Nicholas goes off to war pretty early at the beginning of the book, kind of against his parents' wishes. He goes and enlists. Natasha is pretty young at the beginning of the book, so she's just living at home, kind of doing her thing. She becomes bigger further down the line. Also living in their household is Sonia, who is Natasha's cousin, and super close friends. Sonia is in love with Nicholas, so that becomes a whole thing too. So that's their family, and then you have the Bolkonskis, and there's old Prince Bolkonsky, who is like this senile old man who lives in the country and is just kind of psycho. He has 2 kids. You got Andrew, and then you have Mary. And Mary lives at home with her dad. She's basically his caretaker. He's super manipulative. She's stuck there. Andrew goes off to war. He's an aide-de-camp with a general. He's kind of doing his whole thing. He is married. His wife is pregnant. He leaves his pregnant wife with his dad and sister, and that's kind of where everyone is at the moment. There's a few other one-off characters that you meet, one of which is Dolokhov. Dolokhov is friends with Pierre, Anatole, Andrew. So they kind of have this little crew going at the beginning before they all go off to war and do various things. Pierre gets rich, he doesn't go to war. Dolokhov is also out fighting at the moment. I think that's the main cast of characters. There's a few other one-off ones that I can't remember how big they become, but for example, Boris, who you kind of see here and there. Natasha is in love with him at the beginning of the book. He goes off to war. You kind of get little snippets of him here and there, not super huge. You also have Denisov, who Nicholas meets at war, and they kind of become friends. They're in the same regiment, I guess. They're fighting together. So he kind of becomes a character, and then you have a lot of names that are just recurring names throughout the battles, throughout the social circles that all these people are in, stuff like that. So that's kind of where we're at with all the characters at the moment. The other thing that has happened, in addition to Helene and Pierre getting married, Prince Vasily is trying to arrange a marriage between Mary Bolkonsky and his son Anatole. We don't know this yet, but that doesn't end up working out. But I haven't gotten to that point yet. So it's a little interesting going back and reading this with some of the things. Like, I obviously know who everyone ends up with at the end because I read the book before. So it's a little interesting going back and being like, oh yeah, I forgot that they were trying to make that happen. I'm going to keep plugging ahead. I probably won't update in a while for a little bit unless I really have some thoughts. So I'll probably try and get close to halfway before I update again, unless something interesting happens. Updated in the same spot, but it's just the easiest place to set the camera quickly. I am about halfway through War and Peace now. I've gotten to page, where am I? 466. I've also made it through the part that is the main bulk of what's in the musical. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this video, but there's a musical that follows a section of this book. There are a few parts earlier on that are from the musical, but the bulk of it, I marked it because that was one of my tabs that I specifically did, starts at book 8. Really, the bulk of the musical is just book 8. I would tell you the page numbers, but I feel like that's going to be different depending on which version you have, so that's probably not super helpful, but I believe it's just book 8 is the majority of what's in the musical. And if you don't know, basically it's this crazy drama where Natasha is engaged to Prince Andrew. That was loud. And he goes off to Europe because he's trying to like heal this old war wound that he has that keeps reopening and find a tutor for his son, which his other wife died in childbirth. So that's how he's now engaged to Natasha. But they go to Moscow for a while. She meets Anatole. They have like a 3-day little romance. He convinces her to elope with him. She gets caught. It becomes this whole thing. She turns down Prince Andrew. All the drama ensues. And this is really kind of the main section of the book where you're just fully focused on the characters. We're not touching the war. We're not touching the historical aspects of things. It's just character driven. And then book 8 ends. And book 9 throws you right back into full war zone. Napoleon has now crossed the border into Russia, and we are starting into that whole storyline. That is the point where my other tab that I set up at the beginning for Tolstoy's rants comes into play. I don't know if you can tell. Yeah, you probably cannot tell at all, but there are a few orange tabs that I've started sticking in. And these orange tabs are for the spots where I feel like if you were reading War and Peace just for the characters, you can skip those parts. Tolstoy, when it gets into this section, gets very long-winded about history and all the maneuvers that people are making and stuff like that, that if you're in it to learn about like the history of the Napoleonic Wars in Russia is interesting. It's not like poorly written, but if you're there for the characters, it's a little long-winded and lengthy, especially coming from the part that's in the musical where it's so character driven. And then all of a sudden the characters are just like interspersed into this conversation about Napoleon. So for example, in book 9, right at the beginning, it starts off with a, let's see, how long is it? 1, 2, basically 3-page rant about why the war started. And if you're just there for the characters, that has nothing to do with them at all. So basically what I've been doing is I've been going through and writing like my own chapter headings that just kind of sum up the chapters. I don't know if you can see right there. So for example, chapter 2, Napoleon starts his army towards Russia. That's all that happens in that whole chapter. And nothing has to do with any of the characters. And then you get like 1 chapter that's applicable, and then you get like 3 chapters, and that's what I'm in the middle of right now, of just Russia's emperor sending a message to Napoleon and him trying to find Napoleon in the message. Like, it's so long, has nothing to do with the characters. We're just trying to get a letter there. And these are the parts where I feel like if you wanted to read War and Peace and have it a little bit shortened and you were just there for the characters, you could just skip them. You just need like the little brief title heading. I could sum it up for you in a paragraph, basically. So that's gonna be, I think, a lot of what my tabbing is over the next half of the book, is marking those places and summing things up, which I think is actually a really good exercise if you're trying to work on your like reading comprehension, to go through and summarize each chapter. So I'm sure I'll remember these part better now that I've done this, but that's kind of where I'm at. And I'm just gonna keep working through this. I don't have a ton else to say. Up to this point, it is pretty character driven. The plot's pretty good. I did, for a while there, you get really into the flow of stuff. So now it's gonna slow down a little bit, I'm worried, but I'm trying to get through it fast. So hopefully that doesn't slow me down too much, but we'll see. So I'm just gonna jump back into it. When I have another update, I will let you know. I'll probably try and update at least 1 more time before I fully finish the book, but we'll see. Maybe I'll have stuff to say, I don't know. So yeah, that's my update. Let's get back to reading. I am done with War and Peace. I will be quite honest with you, I don't think I've ever been so excited to finish a video. And it's not that this book is necessarily bad. It's just that the last little bit has been a bit of a slog to get through. Where do I even start? One of the biggest spots where he goes off is the second epilogue. Yes, there are 2 epilogues. The second one, which is about the last 30 pages of the book, is basically Tolstoy writes an essay on the, what's the word? Basically he writes an essay on how he views historians and the work that they do. And it is super confusing. It makes no sense. There are a lot of big words and it is highly repetitive. So just as an example, let me find a good paragraph. A lot of it is about like free will and how history looks at who causes things and stuff like that. So here's just an example of what I've been reading for the last 30 pages. Thus our conception of free will and inevitability gradually diminishes or increases according to the greater or lesser connection with the external world. We get the conception of a minimum of inevitability and a maximum of freedom. So yeah, there's like 2 paragraphs of the 30 pages of this essay that Tolstoy writes at the end. And he has a lot of thoughts on history and historians and what they are doing and how they determine things. So that's what a lot of makes this book hard to read. The plot and the characters that you're following and the actual storyline is very interesting, and I think it's quite enjoyable. One of the other big issues with the whole going off is you kind of get everything twice in the second half of the book. You get it from the perspective of the characters, and then you get it from the like historian's point of view, which for some people, if you're going through this and like studying it for class, I'm sure is really interesting. But as just a person reading it for enjoyment, it's a little bit of a slog because it feels like you get it described in this way that you super connect to with the characters, and then you all of a sudden flash back and you get just the play-by-play, run it out, nothing super interesting. And I just don't feel like you actually need both to get the general concept of it, right? It's the whole idea of, do you walk through everything in entirety of detail and show the whole big picture, or do you take it from a character's point of view and let people experience it through one person? And he just decided to do both. So that's a big part of what makes this book slow and hard to read. And what makes it so long is that a lot of the stuff in the second half of the book you are getting twice. That being said, there are still lots of fun lines. I feel like the fun lines definitely decrease once you get into that part, because a lot of the history stuff is just very straightforward. He's not writing in his observant of human nature, which is the stuff that I find really interesting. I think that's what I like about Tolstoy's writing, is when he describes people, and he's very observant about people and he describes it really well. And you don't get as much of that when he's walking you through the play-by-play of a battle. I didn't do a great job of like fully explaining the whole plot. If you would be interested in a full plot breakdown, I could do that at some point, but I feel like this video is probably long enough without needing to do that. The other thing about this book, if you're reading it for the narrative purposes, is it's not really like a super conclusive wrapped up book. It just kind of ends at some point, and then he goes into his whole little history essay thing, and that's just like the end of the book. So it's not the most conclusive ending, but you do get a lot of their storyline. Like, you get basically the second epilogue jumps or kind of recaps several, like 10 years after the events of the main part of the book. So you do get kind of this look at where a lot of the characters end up. It's not every character, which is why I say this is not a super conclusive ending. There are characters that just at some point, it's just the last scene you see them in, and you don't get anything else after that. You're just like, oh, I wonder what ended up happening with them. But you never know. So that's my thoughts on War and Peace. Do I recommend reading it? If you have a lot of time on your hands and you're really interested in Russian literature, I do think it is such a good feeling to be able to say that you've read it. So I don't know if I'd recommend it to everyone, but I do think that if you are interested in it, you should at least give it a shot. And I do highly recommend listening to the musical, because that helps you a lot with getting people's names down. Oh, and one other thing is, this is my first time annotating a book, so I guess I should talk about that. I don't know that I'm going to become a frequent annotator. I do feel like it slows down my reading a bit. I think it is fun for books like this that have really interesting writing or lots of good quotes, but I don't think that for just like a typical fiction book, I am going to be an annotator. I'll probably stick with I'm mostly not annotating, but if I see a quote that I really like, I'll mark it, is probably how it is. I wouldn't be opposed to sitting down and specifically annotating some books, specifically other classics, but I don't foresee myself doing this with like fantasy or mysteries and thrillers. So if there are other books that you'd like to see me do this with, I think another one that I'd love to do at some point is Tale of Two Cities. That is one of my favorite classics, and I've read it a couple times. so I feel like it wouldn't be too bad to reread it and do an annotate of it. But yeah, if there are other books that you would like to see me do this video I did with, let me know. And with that, I'm gonna end this video off because it is plenty long. So thank you so much for coming along on this journey with me. I am very happy to be ending this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.